What was your first clue that something was wrong, whether or not you knew that there was a chasm there?
There are a couple of different environments that I've experienced over the years in relation to tech debt. So one has been an approach where essentially every couple of years you are replatforming. And so you do have a long-term vision, but you are kind of managing tech debt alongside new features on a very ongoing basis. And so while every company has some amount of tech debt, it's not as though getting it down to zero is feasible or desirable, that there's kind of that proactive strategy in place. And then I've also been in the experience where I've found myself kind of in that moment that you're describing, where I thought it was actually going to be a scenario where we could address some of the developer velocity concerns. That was kind of my first cue. I'm wondering why it's taking so long in order to build new stuff. And I thought it was maybe more about like retooling processes, retooling the way that we organize teams, and kind of taking more of a product management or program management approach to it. And even though that was maybe part of what was contributing to it, ended up finding as the months went on that the issue was a bit more deeply rooted than I had initially surmised.
When the organization noticed a velocity issue, as you mentioned, one of the first things companies usually look at is process and operations. So then there's some sense of this transformation. Let's do an operational or process transformation. And suddenly now we have more visibility than we did before. We're more efficient, and we have what you mentioned, capacity allocation in place now. We have levers that we can pull. Was there a point in your experience where you mentioned, at least now we can pull the levers and we can say 35% tech debt, 65% feature development. Now, these transformations are excellent for the points you stated. At the same time, that 65% feature development, the operations may be more efficient, but the time to implementation, it may not have shaved off enough. And suddenly there's this question of, as you mentioned, how much tech debt do we push on versus feature development that will enable us to move faster on feature development eventually? Have you experienced that kind of tension? Then the second question is, was there ever a point where it was like, hold on, under what conditions would an organization have to go feature development off, tech debt on, just fix this problem?
That's a good question. I think that when it comes to considering the question of should we completely turn off feature development in favor of tech debt, at least in my experience, I haven't been in a scenario where any of the stakeholders at the table were championing stopping feature development, including any of the technical leadership. I wasn't, certainly my business counterparts. I think that we did need to have cross-functional negotiation about what our tolerance was and what that percentage would be, and coming up with what it would be. And going under 50% customer-facing value is ultimately where we built consensus of like, no, I don't think we could quite afford to do that, and ultimately hit our numbers and satisfy our customers and work against the vision that we have for what we're accomplishing here. Is that the answer? Is that the best answer? I don't know. I'm sure there are a lot of different ways to do it, or different companies are in different decisions. But in my experience, turning the dial all the way down on customer value has never been on the table.
What I just heard, though, and I think is probably an interesting thing to call out, is at one point, and I'm curious for how long, it sounds like you did drop down to maybe not quite 50, but close to 50% of your capacity as an organization was basically just toward tech debt maintenance. Is that right? That's massive.
This is a pill to swallow. But when you are in this chasm, you find yourself and you realize the impact that technical debt is having on your ability to build your vision. The only thing you can do is come up with a way to address it. I'm happy to go into some of the details of the way that we addressed it, but it did involve making a big commitment and having transparency with our organization about what that was going to take. And because this wasn't something that we could just kind of shoot over, put this in the corner, it's something that we all felt. It's a hard place to be, but it's important to reckon with it and address it.
Yeah, as a product leader, I'm speaking to other product leaders who are going through this, or who have gone through this, or who may soon go through this. What kind of advice would you have for them? And in what way did you approach it, that negotiation, when you know that you're incentivizing the organization to ensure that feature development is at its maximum?
Great questions. In terms of how I initially would think about tech debt as a product person I was kind of like, well, the engineers are going to do that. And as I've grown in my career, I think take a bit more responsibility and accountability as a product leader for the integrity of the platform and realize that there are no parts of it, regardless of how technical it is, that I can't be ultimately accountable for as the person whose job it is to ensure that we are building and selling whatever it is that we're building and selling. That was an initial shift for me, was just stepping into a bit more of a mindset of taking accountability and then using the skills and tools that I've used as a product leader to build new features and applying them to this more technical challenge, which was ultimately prioritizing having the team dig into the issues, itemizing them all out, just get everything on the table, big or small, coming up with a way to categorize and score these and understand the different ways in which each of these line items was impacting our platform health, our customer experience. So some of those categories is making it easier to introduce bugs, is reducing developer velocity, is potentially getting behind the ball on things related to compliance or keeping up with partner APIs or security or how we deploy. There are a lot of different categories that these types of initiatives could fall under. I think that makes it easier as well to understand the business value of addressing which ones and understanding which ones are urgent versus which ones will be urgent. And then, of course, starting to take a swag and size, and maybe there are some smaller ones we could start with. Maybe there's some bigger ones that we need to start now because, look, this is going to be a 2-year effort and we're going to need to put one story and sprint in it for 2 years. And that's how we're going to ultimately upgrade a language that we're using or whatever it may be. So that ended up being kind of our tactical approach to helping to turn it from something that's just like, this is bad, this is big, it's having a big impact, to, okay, we understand this and we understand how to make decisions about it. We understand how to communicate about it and we know how we're going to pay it down.
I love that. It sounds so obvious when you say it. You're applying business metrics to the actual technical work as well, instead of only sort of relegating that to feature development. You're describing a framework to discuss relative cost, relative value, relative risk. And that becomes the driver, just as it would for any other feature, for the actual tech enablement as well. It's always interesting to me how often that is missed. How often that's a thing that has to be discovered. And so it's really nice to hear that's how you began to think about it as well, because I think that makes a lot of sense.
Ultimately, we're talking about culture, and there are different types of cultures on different development teams, different companies, different size companies, different age companies, different types of products. And so there really, I think, isn't a one size fits all. And there are some software organizations that are more product led, that are more engineering led, that are more design led, that are more sales led. And depending on all of those different factors, are probably going to have a different way of approaching something like technical debt.
Through your story, you've said my favorite P word several times. You've said the word platform several times. And I'm kind of curious, I've run into so many different definitions of that word when you're using it here and when you were using it in the midst of all of this. To give some context into this question, I often hear a reaction to this type of thing is the platform play or re-platforming or trying a new foundational platform. And we've been guilty of using some of these terms as well. Commercial platform or technical platform, it can mean a lot of different things. I'm curious, was that a conversation for you when you were in the middle of this, or was there just sort of a broad consensus? How did you approach that word and fundamentally what it begins to mean to the organization?
That's a really good question. Every time I mention something about a re-platform to any engineers that I work with or my life outside of work, the first question is, well, what do you mean by that? Especially working in the B2B space where the word platform is used commercially and in your conversations with your customers about essentially representing what you're selling.